Back then, I worked as a receptionist at an office downtown. It was a decent job, but the hours were all over the place. The night it all went down, I left work around 10 p.m. Downtown was practically deserted, and walking alone through those empty streets was unsettling, but I was used to it. I'd missed my bus, so my only option was to grab a ride through an app. It wasn't the first time I'd done this late at night, but for some reason, as soon as I got into the car that night, I felt this weird knot in my chest. I brushed it off and pretended everything was fine. The driver seemed normal at first glance. A guy in his early 40s, thinning hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and a calm way of talking. He even tried to make small talk at the start, asking about my job. I answered out of politeness, but I wasn't in the mood to chat. After a few minutes of silence, I noticed something odd. He'd turned off the GPS sound. When I glanced at his phone screen, I saw he wasn't following the route at all. He started turning down streets I didn't recognize. Dark streets with no lights, spaced-out houses, and rusty wire fences. My stomach sank. I asked, trying to sound casual, "You're not following the GPS, are you?" He gave me this calm smile that sent a chill down my spine and said, "Oh, this way's quicker. Trust me." I decided to stay quiet and watch. With every turn, it felt like we were getting farther away from any signs of life. There wasn't a soul on the sidewalks, and most of the houses looked abandoned, broken windows, fallen gates. I tried to keep my cool, but I started noticing little things that made me even more uneasy. His grip on the wheel was tight, both hands firmly planted, and his expression had changed. He'd seemed laid back before, but now he looked tense, almost focused. I gripped my phone and quickly texted a friend, sharing my location and the car's make and model, but the signal was terrible, and the message wouldn't go through. When he turned onto a completely empty road surrounded by tall trees, my heart started racing. There was nothing around, no houses, no shops, no streetlights, just the dark stretch of asphalt and the hum of the engine. I tried again, saying, I think the GPS was showing a different way. Wouldn't it be better to go back?" He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, but this time he didn't smile. He just said, "Don't worry, we're almost there." The way he said it sounded more like a command than an attempt to reassure me. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong, and panic started creeping in. My mind was racing, but I knew I had to stay calm. I glanced at the door next to me and tried to pull the lock, but it was engaged. That wasn't unusual. Lots of drivers keep the doors locked for safety. But at that moment, it felt like I was trapped. I tried reopening the app to see if I could get support or share my live location, but the signal was still dead. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in the silence of the car. The driver didn't say another word, and the only sounds were the muted hum of the tires on the road and my own shaky breathing. Suddenly, he slowed down and pulled the car over to the side of the road. I looked around, but all I could see were trees and a small clearing ahead, dimly lit by the headlights. He turned off the engine and sat there in silence for a few seconds, just staring straight ahead, like he was deciding what to do. My throat went dry. Forcing a smile, I asked, trying to sound casual, "Why'd we stop here? Is everything okay?" He turned his head slowly, the light from the dashboard reflecting off his glasses. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, with an eerily calm voice, "I just need to take care of something real quick. Won't take long." When he reached for the central lock lever, my body froze. That was the moment I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The second I heard the click of the locks engaging, panic took over. I yanked at the door handle with all my strength, even though I knew it wouldn't budge. He stepped out of the car, calmly shutting the door behind him as if this was just a normal stop, and started walking toward the trunk. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body felt paralyzed. I glanced around the car, desperate for anything I could use to defend myself, but the interior was spotless. The only thing within reach was my phone charger cable. My hands trembled so much it felt impossible to think straight. When he opened the trunk, I heard a metallic clinking sound, like tools or something heavy being moved around. My heart nearly stopped. In a desperate burst of energy, I started banging on the window and screaming as loud as I could, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. The area seemed completely deserted, but I had to try. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't reacting. He didn't look back, didn't speed up, nothing. It was like he'd done this before, like this was routine for him. My panic deepened, and I knew I had to act fast before he came back to the car. While he was busy at the trunk, I managed to unlock my phone and tried calling 911, even though I had no signal. It didn't matter. I had to try. I hit the call button, but, as expected, the call didn't go through. The crushing sense of helplessness was almost unbearable. That's when I noticed something. A small opening in the backseat window, barely a few inches wide. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. I filled my lungs and screamed at the top of my voice, "Help! Somebody help me!" My voice echoed into the empty night, with no response. But it did provoke a reaction. From him. He slammed the trunk shut with a loud bang and started walking back toward the car, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. My mind was spiraling. I had to get out of there, but the doors were still locked. Then, in a last surge of courage, I dove into the front seat, frantically searching for the unlock button. My hands were shaking so much that it felt like I couldn't find anything. He was already at the car, and his expression had changed. It was serious now, his eyes narrowed, radiating frustration. Just as his hand touched the outside handle, my fingers finally found the button. I pressed it hard, and the mechanical sound of the locks disengaging filled the car. Without a second thought, I pushed the door open and threw myself out, stumbling as I hit the ground in my rush to escape. As soon as I got out of the car, I started running without even looking back. The ground was uneven, full of roots and rocks, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that man. I could hear the frantic, uneven sound of my footsteps and the crunch of dry leaves beneath them, but nothing else. I didn't know if he was chasing me, and somehow that uncertainty made it even worse. The clearing narrowed into a dark, tree-lined path, and it felt like I was running into a void. My breathing was ragged, my chest burned, but I didn't stop. After a few minutes, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a single rusty street lamp with a flickering bulb that looked like it was about to die. Below it was a narrow dirt road. I ran straight for it, hoping a car might pass by or that I'd at least find a house nearby. When I reached the street lamp, I finally looked back for the first time. There was no sign of him, but the fear still clung to me, pulsing in the back of my mind. It was as if the danger was lurking just out of sight, ready to pounce. My body stayed on high alert, ready to take off again at the slightest hint of movement. While I tried to catch my breath under the dim light, I heard the distant sound of an engine. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest, but I soon realized it was a car coming down the road. I jumped into the middle of the lane, waving my arms frantically. Thankfully, the car, a beat-up old vehicle, slowed down and stopped a few feet away. The driver, an elderly man with white hair and a puzzled expression, rolled down his window and asked what had happened. I could barely string a sentence together. Between sobs and gasping breaths, I explained that I was running from a man who had locked me in his car. The man didn't hesitate. He told me to get in, and as soon as I shut the door, he sped off, saying he'd take me to the nearest police station. While we drove down the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man's car following us, but it never appeared. When we finally reached the police station, I told the officers everything. The car's make and model, the name that showed up on the ride app, and the exact spot where he had stopped. They asked me a lot of questions and promised to investigate, but what stuck with me the most was the serious expression of the officer who took my statement. "You're very lucky to have gotten away," he said. Situations like this don't always end this way. To this day, I don't know what that man had planned for me, and honestly, I don't want to imagine it. All I know is that I never used a ride-sharing app again after that night. The relief of surviving doesn't erase the fear I still feel whenever I think about his calm face and the metallic sounds coming from the trunk.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
At the end of last year, my life was a total mess. I'd lost my job as an administrative assistant and was scraping by with odd jobs. My rent was 2 months overdue, and the idea of spending Christmas on the streets felt more real with each passing day. One humid December morning, I went out to try and sell some stuff I had stashed in the closet, including an old coffee maker I hardly ever used. I was rushing through the downtown streets, lost in thought about how my life had taken such a crazy turn to end up like this, when something on the ground caught my eye. It was a crumpled lottery ticket, stuck in a shallow puddle. I picked it up without much thought. Maybe out of curiosity or maybe just hoping for a miracle. The ticket looked almost new, except for a torn corner and a few smudges of dirt. On the back, someone had scribbled a combination of numbers in pen, like they'd been checking results. I don't usually play the lottery, but I recognized it was for last week's drawing. On impulse, I walked into the first lottery retailer I saw. When the clerk scanned the ticket, she froze. She looked at the screen, then at me, and didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she said, "Sir, this ticket, you've won. You've won the jackpot!" It was like time stopped. She explained that I'd need to go to a specific bank branch to claim the prize. My heart was pounding with excitement. I couldn't even think straight. Just that finally, my luck had changed. Or at least, that's what I thought. The next morning I woke up early, both nervous and excited. I picked out a shirt that looked a little more presentable and even spritzed on some cologne. It felt like some kind of good luck ritual at that point. The bank was on the other side of town, and the bus ride felt endless. Every stop reminded me of how much time I'd spent drowning in debt and worry. But now all of that was going to change. When I got to the bank, it was way fancier than I expected. Huge revolving doors and a security guard who sized me up like he knew I didn't belong there. I took a deep breath and walked in. A serious-looking woman greeted me and asked for my ID and the ticket. She glanced at the documents, typed something into her computer, and then frowned in a way that made my stomach flip. "Sir, there's a problem," she said carefully. "This ticket was reported stolen 2 days ago." For a second, it felt like she was speaking another language. I explained that I'd found the ticket on the street, but she just shook her head, saying they'd have to involve the police. I tried to argue, but my voice got quieter as it sank in that nothing I said would change the situation. The next few days were a blur of frustration and paranoia. I left the bank with my head spinning, the ticket confiscated, and this weird sense that this was just the beginning. The manager came out and confirmed they'd have to suspend the process. I couldn't stop wondering if I'd made a huge mistake taking the ticket to the bank. Had someone seen me pick it up? Were there cameras? The police never came looking for me, which was a relief at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first time, he was standing on the corner near my apartment, leaning against a lamppost like he was waiting for someone. Then I noticed the man in the black suit. I didn't think much of it until I saw him again the next day, in the exact same spot, looking straight in my direction. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just someone who worked nearby, but there was something about him that didn't seem normal. His suit was immaculate, not a single wrinkle, and he wore a hat that looked like it belonged in another era. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his stare, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. I decided to test something. I walked to the corner store, pretending I was shopping. When I came out, he was still there, but this time he'd moved a little closer. The way he watched me sent a chill down my spine. There was no ignoring it. Whoever he wasn't there by accident. That night, the unease wouldn't let me sleep. I tossed and turned, obsessing over that man. Who was he? What did he want from me? I decided I had to get to the bottom of it. The next day, when I saw him again, this time standing in the park across from my apartment, I worked up the courage to approach him. As I got closer, my breathing got heavier, and my hands started sweating. But he didn't respond or even look back. It wasn't hurried, but it also didn't leave me any chance to catch up. I followed, calling out, "Hey, you! Why are you following me?" But just as I was a few steps away, he turned and began walking away. The chase lasted about 10 minutes. He led me through streets I didn't recognize, eventually taking me to a more deserted part of the neighborhood, full of empty lots. That's when he suddenly stopped, slowly, and turned to face me. Finally, I got a good look at his face up close. There was something unsettling about his expression. It was like he was smiling and completely serious at the same time. his face void of any real emotion. "You shouldn't have taken what wasn't yours," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. But it echoed in my mind like he'd shouted. My body froze. I didn't know what to say or do, but fear gripped me completely. My first instinct was to take a step back. There was something about him that made me feel like I was standing in front of something unexplainable, something not human. His words kept ringing in my ears. "What wasn't yours?" My mind raced. Was he talking about the ticket? How could he possibly know about that? The silence between us lasted only seconds, but it felt like forever. When I finally managed to muster up the courage to say something, he stepped forward. And that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with an ordinary person. The air around him felt colder, and for a moment, I was sure his shadow on the ground didn't match the movements of his body. That night, everything felt different. The silence in my house, which usually brought me comfort, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the wood, every sound from the street made me jump. I sat on the couch, staring out the window, waiting for something. I didn't even know what. I couldn't sleep again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that strange shadow on the ground, the way he spoke like he knew more about me than I knew about myself. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt a small sense of relief. Daylight made everything seem less surreal. But I knew this wasn't over. I decided I had to leave the house. Staying there was only making my paranoia worse. I hopped on the first bus downtown with no real destination in mind. I just needed movement, people around me, something to make me feel normal again. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Even in the middle of the crowd, I could feel it, like a pair of eyes was fixed on me. Then I saw him again, standing across the street in the same pristine suit, the hat shading part of his face. He didn't move, didn't cross the street, but I knew he was there for me. My heart started pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I ducked into a nearby cafe, sitting close to the door so I could watch to see if he followed or kept watching me. I ordered a coffee, but my hands were shaking so much I nearly spilled the cup. I glanced out the window, trying to act casual, and he was still there, completely still, like a statue. People walked by him, but no one seemed to notice him, like he was invisible to everyone but me. That scared me even more. Was I losing my mind? Was this all in my head? I pulled out my phone and started Googling anything that might give me a clue. Man in black suit, strange follower, threats after lottery ticket. That's when I stumbled across stories from people describing something eerily similar. A mysterious man who appeared after unexplained events, watching and following but never directly attacking. The idea that others had seen something like this sent a chill through me. The stories varied, but they all had one thing in common. No one knew who he was or what he really wanted. But eventually, he would vanish as suddenly as he appeared. That gave me a tiny spark of hope. Maybe if I ignored him, he'd leave me alone too. I decided to follow the logic of the stories I'd read. Ignore him and wait for him to go away. Easier said than done. Even when I tried to distract myself with other things, the feeling of being watched never left me. I started noticing other strange details. Whenever he showed up, the environment around him seemed quieter, like the sounds of the city faded into the background. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it gave me the sense that the whole world was retreating when he was near. That only made my paranoia worse. By the third day, things escalated. I woke up to the sound of my doorbell ringing over and over. My heart raced. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Still, the overwhelming feeling that he was close, right outside, was crushing. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank or maybe a neighbor, but when I opened the door, I found something that froze me to my core. On the ground was a lottery ticket identical to the one I'd found on the street days before. The same set of numbers, the same torn corner. My hands shook as I picked it up, glancing around, but the hallway was empty. I slammed the door shut, trying to process what it meant. How had he gotten another ticket? And worse, why did he want me to see it? After finding the ticket at my door, I spent hours sitting on the couch, staring at that piece of paper like it might explode. Its presence seemed to fill the room with something dark, as if just holding it had invited a shadow into my home. I thought about getting rid of it, throwing it away or burning it, but I was terrified of what might happen if I did. Maybe that's exactly what he wanted. Every theory I came up with seemed more ridiculous than the last, but I couldn't stop obsessing over what that man in the suit was trying to tell me. That night, the doorbell rang again, but this time I didn't move. I sat frozen in the dark, barely breathing, trying to ignore it. Then I heard something even more unsettling. 3 soft knocks on the door, almost gentle, like he knew I was there. My entire body went rigid. I couldn't bring myself to look through the peephole, but even without seeing him, I knew he was out there. When the silence finally returned, I waited for hours before getting up to check. Carefully, I opened the door, and once again, the hallway was empty. But this time, there was something different. A small black mark on the door, like a symbol etched into the wood. It was a triangle with an eye in the center, drawn with such precision it looked like it had been engraved by a machine. That was the last straw. I knew I couldn't stay there a second longer. The next morning, without a second thought, I packed a backpack with the essentials and decided to leave town for a while. I figured if I got far enough away, maybe all of this would finally be behind me. I took the first bus out of the station and ended up in a small town about 4 hours away. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I turned off my phone and paid for a hotel room in cash. For a while, it seemed to work. I spent 2 quiet days with no sign of the man in the black suit, and I started to believe I'd finally escaped. But on the 3rd night, as I looked out the window of my hotel room, he appeared. There he was, standing on the sidewalk across the street, wearing the same pristine suit and tilted hat. My heart raced, and tears streamed down my face before I could stop them. No matter where I went, he always found me. It was as if he wasn't following my steps, but rather something I carried. Something he could track with precision. I sank to the floor of the room, desperately trying to think of what to do. That's when a desperate idea came to me. What if I gave the ticket back? The next morning, I returned to the city. As scared as I was, it felt like the only way out. The ticket was stuffed deep in my backpack, folded so many times it was on the verge of tearing. The thought of handing it over terrified me, but I had no other choice. As soon as I got back to my building, there he was, standing on the same corner where I'd first seen him. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took a deep breath, crossed the street, and walked straight up to him, clutching the ticket like it was an offering. He didn't say anything as I approached. He just looked at me with that cold, empty stare, yet somehow radiating an authority I couldn't defy. I held out the ticket, my hands trembling. "This is what you want, isn't it? Take it. I don't want it anymore." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and took the ticket. The moment his fingers touched the paper, an icy wind swept through the street, making my skin crawl. He glanced at the ticket, then back at me, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was warped, unnatural, something that made my stomach churn. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I thought that was the end, but I couldn't relax. For weeks I braced myself for his return. Every sound in the hallway, every shadow on the street, made me jump. But he never came back. When I finally worked up the courage to check, I found out the lottery prize had been claimed by someone else. The police never contacted me, and life slowly moved on. But the feeling that he was still watching never truly left. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. All I know is that since that day, I've never picked up anything that wasn't mine, no matter how tempting it looks. It's just not worth the risk.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was just another December night, the kind where the air feels thick and heavy from the muggy heat. My wife, Lisa, and I were in our 2nd year living in a small house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't big, but it was cozy, with a garden Lisa loved tending to and a security system I'd installed as soon as we moved in. I'm the type of guy who likes to be prepared, you know? Cameras, motion sensors, and, of course, an alarm that, up until then, had never gone off without reason. Life was pretty uneventful back then: work, Netflix before bed, and the occasional nap on the couch during the weekend. Lisa always said I needed to loosen up more, but I liked feeling in control. Maybe that's why what happened that night hit me so hard. I woke up suddenly to the blaring sound of the alarm. Lisa, who's a light sleeper, was already sitting up in bed, her face a mix of confusion and fear. The first thing I did was grab my phone from the nightstand to check the security camera app. My heart was racing, but when I looked at the footage, all I saw were empty hallways inside the house and the stillness of the garden outside. "Probably just an animal passing by," I said, trying to sound confident, though Lisa didn't look convinced. I got up, disarmed the alarm through the app, and headed to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, telling myself it was just a glitch. But before I could finish the glass, the alarm went off again, this time louder, like it was desperately trying to warn us of something. Lisa was already in the living room with me, her wide eyes fixed on mine as I fumbled to pull up the cameras again. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the feeds, and then I saw it. On the camera pointing toward the front gate, there was a figure standing just at the edge of the property. The lighting was dim, making it hard to make out details, but what I could see was enough to send a chill down my spine. It looked like a person, tall and slightly hunched over, but the face was the worst part. It wasn't just unclear, it was as if the camera refused to capture it. All I could see was a dark, blurry void where the face should have been. Lisa took a step back and grabbed my arm. "Who is that?" "Call the cops," she whispered, her voice low like she was afraid speaking louder might draw the thing's attention. Before I could respond, we both blinked, maybe from the nerves or the sudden brightness of the phone screen. When we looked back, the figure was gone. The camera now showed only the empty gate and the grass swaying lightly in the breeze. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but Lisa had seen it too. It was real. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone trying to break in, maybe a creepy neighbor, but why hadn't the alarm picked up the motion the first time? While I was still piecing it together, we heard the sharp click of the living room light switch being flipped. The light was on, but no one was there, or at least no one we could see. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest as Lisa and I exchanged nervous glances, neither of us daring to move. The lights turned on by themselves, flooding the room with a brightness that only made the silence feel heavier. I summoned what little courage I had and walked toward the switch, Lisa clinging to the back of my shirt like that would somehow keep her safe. I flicked the switch off and waited. Nothing. "Probably a short circuit," I muttered, more to myself than to her. But even I didn't believe what I was saying. We sat back down on the couch, and I decided to go through every single camera feed on my phone, one by one, desperate to find anything that could explain what was going on. That's when I saw something that made my breath catch for a second. On the living room camera, the same one where the lights had turned on by themselves, something was off. It was pale, with eyes so deep they looked like black holes. In the window's reflection, a face seemed to be staring back at me, completely still. It wasn't my reflection, nor Lisa's. My finger froze on the screen, unable to move or look away. Lisa, sensing my silence, leaned over my shoulder to glance at the phone. The scream she let out made my whole body tremble. "Turn it off. Turn it off now," she yelled, already crying as she tried to snatch the phone from my hand. But before I could do anything, the image on the screen flickered and disappeared. After that, we couldn't sit still anymore. Lisa kept insisting we leave the house, but something inside me told me running wouldn't solve anything. I called the security company and explained, with a shaky voice, that the alarm had gone off twice and that we were seeing strange things on the cameras. The person on the other end, sounding bored and indifferent, said they'd send a technician in the morning. "In the morning?" I snapped. "We need help now." He replied that, according to their system, everything seemed to be functioning normally and that it was likely an external issue, possibly interference. I hung up, frustrated and even more on edge. It didn't make sense. Interference doesn't turn on lights or project faces in reflections. We decided to do one last check of the house. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only thing that made me feel even a little secure, and we started walking through the rooms together, completely silent. First, the bedrooms. Then the hallway. Finally, the living room again. Everything seemed fine, or at least it looked that way. As we were about to head back to the bedroom, something stopped us. Footsteps. Not inside the house, but outside, in the garden. They were slow, dragging, like someone was walking in circles out there. Lisa gripped my hand tightly, and my first instinct was to run to the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was back. This time, it was closer than before, standing right in the middle of the garden, staring directly at the window where I was. I froze, unsure whether to step back or keep watching. The figure looked even stranger up close. It had no defined features, just a tall, disproportionate body with arms that seemed far too long for its frame. And the face, it was still just a shadow, a void that didn't reflect any light, like a black hole. Lisa was tugging at my arm desperately, begging me to move away, but my feet were glued to the floor. Then, something even more disturbing happened. The figure raised one of its hands and pointed directly at me. It didn't move otherwise, just stood there, frozen in that position. A wave of cold shot through my body, forcing me to take a step back. At that moment, the lights in the living room started flickering. Slowly at first, then frantically, like they were trying to send a message I couldn't understand. Lisa was sobbing now, and I knew we couldn't stay there any longer. I yanked the curtain shut, trying to block out the fact that the figure was still out there, and pulled Lisa with me toward the bedroom. I locked the door behind us, as if that could somehow keep out whatever was happening, and we sat on the floor, clinging to each other, trying to figure out what to do. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. The only sounds were our ragged breathing and the faint ticking of the clock marking the passing hours. After what felt like hours but was probably just a few minutes, the silence was broken by a sound I'll never forget. It was the slow, creaking noise of the gate opening. That metallic screech sent chills down my spine like nothing I'd ever felt before. Lisa gripped my arm so tightly I could feel the pain. My hands were shaking so much I could barely open the camera app on my phone. When I finally managed to pull it up, the camera at the front gate showed the gate wide open, gently swaying in the wind. But the figure was gone. Everything seemed so unnervingly still, like the calm before something terrible. I decided we couldn't wait any longer. Grabbing the car keys, I opened the bedroom door, despite Lisa's hesitation. The hallway was pitch black, and to my surprise, every single light in the house was now off. Lisa held onto my hand like our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. As we reached the living room, the air felt heavier, almost as if we were being watched. Before stepping out the front door, I glanced at the living room camera on my phone. That's when I nearly dropped the device. Sitting on the corner of the couch, the same couch we'd been on just minutes ago, was the figure. Completely still. It was facing the camera directly. I didn't think twice. I grabbed Lisa, and we bolted to the car. My heart was pounding in my chest as I fumbled with the key fob to unlock the doors. We jumped in and locked everything immediately. My hands were trembling so badly it was almost impossible to fit the key into the ignition. Lisa stared at the house, her eyes fixed on the living room door, as if expecting something or someone to come out at any moment. When I finally started the car, I slammed it into reverse and sped down the empty street, not daring to look back. As I drove, my mind raced, trying to make sense of everything: the alarm, the figure, the lights, and now, whatever that thing was inside our house. Lisa was crying softly, muttering that she never wanted to go back. We drove aimlessly for a while until I pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. We sat there in silence, trying to catch our breath and calm down. That's when my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen, and a fresh wave of panic washed over me. It was a notification from the security app, motion detected in the living room. My heart sank. Against my better judgment, I opened the app. The camera feed showed an empty living room, but the couch, the same one where the figure had been, was now flipped over, as if it had been shoved with force. I wanted to throw the phone out the window and never think about that house again, but Lisa grabbed my arm. What if someone's still there? We need to call the police. As much as I wanted to pretend none of this had happened, I knew she was right. I called the police, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what was happening without sounding completely insane. A patrol car met us at the parking lot within minutes. We told them everything we'd seen, but they insisted it was likely just an intruder trying to scare us. Reluctantly, we agreed to go back to the house with them to check things out. It was the worst decision we made that night. When we got back, the police did a thorough sweep of the house. Nothing. No signs of a break-in, no footprints in the garden, nothing out of place except for the flipped couch. One of the officers suggested it might have been a large animal that got in and out before we locked everything up, but we knew that didn't make sense. Still, we nodded and agreed with their report, just to be done with it. Before leaving, they advised us to change the locks and have the security system checked. Larissa and I were too drained to argue. As soon as they left, she begged me to go to a hotel, and I didn't hesitate to agree. The next day, we returned to the house just to grab a few essentials and call a technician to inspect the security system. But something compelled me to check the camera recordings one last time, as if I needed final confirmation of what had happened. I scrolled through the footage from the night before, and for a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. The figure was there. Not just outside or on the couch. On one of the hallway cameras, right before we ran out to the car, I saw something that made my stomach churn. The figure was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, behind us, watching as we fled. We never moved back into that house. We sold everything, relocated to an apartment, and to this day, we avoid talking about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the silence stretches too long, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And I'm certain that if I look fast enough, I'll see that empty face again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.